Hello, Ya Ali Madad, and welcome back to the Ismaili Intellectual Tradition YouTube channel. This is your host Navid Amiri, back with a new series for the channel. So for those who are wondering about what's going on with the Reason and Faith series, do not be alarmed. That is still continuing. I will still be running that series, but I'm going to run that series in parallel with this new history series. So this episode is going to be a history episode, but then the episode after this, we will continue the Reason and Faith series and then go back to the history one, so on and so forth. You'll get the idea as we go. But I'll be alternating between these two so that we have a couple different topics running in parallel for the channel. So without further ado, let's begin exploring our topic for this episode. So, like I said, we're going to be talking about history. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by history is that, of course, this is the Ismaili Intellectual Tradition YouTube channel. And so we're trying to understand basically history, but from the perspective and narrative of the Shia Muslims and Ismaili Muslims more specifically, right? And so for that reason, in order to really understand the justification, or the reason why the Shia and the Ismailis in particular exist, as this subgroup within the wider Muslim Ummah, it's very, very important to go back to the origins, right, of the Islamic movement under the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Because that's where the legitimacy, that's where everything sort of begins, right? For why, how a group defines itself, right? In terms of its interpretation, its particular tradition, and so on and so forth. So the central question that we're going to be looking at initially is, who was the Prophet Muhammad? And why was he the prophet who revealed what we would call Islam today, to the people of Arabia? So in order to understand this, right, this is something that's extremely important because while many people have the idea that this is kind of a consensus, or there's like not really anything controversial about this, that would actually not historically be true. You may have today a situation where lots of people have more of a consensus, or maybe they, buy into a certain narrative more so. But if we look at this through a wider historical lens, if we look at Muslims historically, there's been a lot of diversity in terms of understanding and defining who the Prophet was, what was special about him, and what his mission and purpose was, right? And also what his relationship or unique relationship to God or Allah was. This is extremely, extremely important, and it's the center of a lot of theological and sectarian debate. So it's actually very important that we talk about this. And so in order to begin to understand this, we're going to start basically from the scripture itself, right? So if we want to understand the Prophet, and we want to start from a point which is, in a sense, neutral, relatively speaking, or something in which the Muslims more or less can all agree with, we would have to start with the Qur'an, right? Because this is the discourse that the Prophet is using to explain, in essence, what the message is. And we have only one Qur'an that the Muslim Ummah has, agreed with, one particular text of the Qur'an that today is considered the official version of the Qur'an, and it's been that way almost since the very beginning. Just a few decades here and there, right? And so when we look at the Qur'an, and what we will find is that there are, in fact, three very important things that distinguish the Prophet from other people, all right? So basically three things that are, in a sense, the markers of his prophethood, as him as being the occupier of the office of the prophet. Now, one of the things is Nass, right? And so Nass Some of you might be familiar with this word and some of you might not be. If you're Shia, you probably are very familiar with this word. But Nass basically is a term that means designation, right? And what we mean by Nass is the idea that the Quran implies very heavily, or depending on how you read it, it implies very heavily that those who hold authority among the people, to be prophets, to be guides, to actually deliver, in a sense, the command, right, of Allah to the people, right, for people to understand who they are, what their purpose is, and how they should live. This comes through people who are chosen by God, right? So these are not people who are random, or people who are just self-proclaimed prophets or guides or whatever. These are people from who, in a sense, receive a kind of permission and ijaza or whatever from God Himself in some sense, right? So there's a sense in which there is a designation, and that God is the one who makes this choice, right? Because human beings cannot make this identification themselves. Because otherwise that would imply human beings already having knowledge of things which they shouldn't have knowledge of, right? How would they identify a true guide if they don't know what true guidance is, right? That's almost like if we were going to sit here and decide, on our own, who to pick as, who's going to be our doctor, or who's going to be our teacher in a subject without there being any kind of qualifications, without there being any kind of regulatory board or something that tells us, who's qualified to be a doctor or a teacher. We can't do that, and we really don't do that, practically speaking, right? That's the idea of Nass. The other thing is the lineage, all right? So the lineage of the Prophet is also considered extremely important in the Quran. And we will talk more about that later. But basically, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the idea that one of the claims to the Prophet's legitimacy is his descent from Abraham or Ibrahim, through his son Ismail, right? Or Ishmael, as it is said, stated in the Bible. And so for that reason, it's also very important to analyze that aspect and what its importance is. And the third thing, of course, is this idea of mojiza, right? Or miracles, right? This idea of prophetic miracle. So there is something about the Prophet that distinguishes him in a certain miraculous capacity from other people, right? A certain way in which he really demonstrates his superior inspiration, right? The fact that his intellect is inspired by a higher power, right? And that it doesn't operate in the same way or in the same realm that the minds of other people operate in. And so that ends up being the third very important marker. The one that we're going to be focusing on today, right now, is going to be Nass, right? So the designation, the idea that it is God who chooses who is going to be a prophet or a guide, however, whoever it might be. And so we need to understand, well, okay, now how does that point to the Prophet, right? What is in what way was the Prophet designated? So that's going to be sort of the focus that we're going to be looking at today. All right. So in order to begin this discussion on how we understand Nass, again, we're going to be looking to the Quran, right? That's basically our central source in order to really look, from the beginning, in order to have a basis for what we're going to be talking about. And so the part of the Quran I'm talking about specifically is Surah 7, Ayah 157. And in this ayah here, it refers to this idea of those who follow the messenger, the unlettered prophet, which is commonly understood to be referring to Muhammad himself, whom they find written in what they have of the Torah and the Gospel. Okay? So this ayah here is telling us that this prophet, who is proclaiming, who is revealing the Quran to us, right? Who is giving these recitations, these verses to us. There is a claim being made that the Torah and the Gospels, in fact, speak of him. Okay? And so that's exactly where we're going to start, is to say, okay, well, if the Quran is telling us that we can see some kind of indication in the previous scriptures, right? So the most recent ones before the Islamic revelation, so specifically the Judeo-Christian revelations, right? That basically gives us a guidepost of where we want to begin, of where we want to go, right? You can understand that. So we start with the Quran and then we try to see, okay, where does that take us, right? And so this is taking us now towards the Judeo-Christian scriptures. And so I want to turn your attention now to a few important verses that we find, all right? So if we look in the book of Genesis, first of all, so this is going to be the book of Genesis 17:20. And if we look there, we see the following. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful, and I will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. Okay? So this is one situation where we're talking about, again, this is referring to Ismail or Ishmael, right? And it's referring to the fact that he will be made fruitful. So this idea of his descendants, right? So fruitfulness in terms of humankind refers to their bearing of progeny or offspring, right? And so the numbers of his offspring will be greatly increased. He will be the father of rulers, and there will be a great nation that emerges from him, right? From him and from his progeny, from his lineage, okay? And if we remember, the Prophet Muhammad's lineage is said to trace back to Hazrat Ibrahim or Abraham through Ismail, right? Or Ishmael. So this is one very important part here, right? So Muslims have popularly believed that this is one reference to the Prophet. Now, another one we can find in Deuteronomy 18, verses 18 through 19. So if we look here, this is what we have. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto you. And the you here is Moses. And will put my words into his mouth. And he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. And it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hearken unto my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. Okay? So this is talking about a prophet, right? So now we have an even more specific idea that there is a prophet who is to come, right? And this is being spoken to Moses, of course, right? Because Deuteronomy, this is one of the 5 books of Moses where the law, the Jewish law basically is outlined, right? Within the Torah, right? These 5 books of Moses, and Deuteronomy is one of those. So Moses is being told that there will be a prophet who is like him. Okay, so notice we're talking about like Moses, right? Because there are many prophets that are mentioned in the Bible, but we know that there are certain prophets who have certain greater roles and some who have smaller roles, right? We see minor prophets and major prophets, right? So there are prophets that maybe, there's a very short chapter or short, sort of mention of their mission, something important that they did. But there are certain ones that stand out as having had a much more significant role in the sense of, for example, with Moses, you actually have the revelation of a law, right? This is a very great religious revolution that takes place, right? Where in a sense, a special covenant is set up. And that's not something that every prophet does. Every prophet did not bring with them a new set of terms for a covenant, right? So we're talking about a prophet that is like Moses. So therefore, arguably someone who will also establish a covenant, right? Who will, in a sense, be a revolutionary prophet in that sense, and not simply a prophet who is, commenting or expanding upon or simply giving warning or glad tidings, things like that, right? This is something that is like Moses, correct? And it mentions here also that my words will be put into his mouth, right? And if we understand and we look at the history of the prophet, what do we say about the prophet, right? When he would give revelations, his revelations came in these ecstatic states of consciousness, right? So people would actually see visibly a physical change in the state, in terms of the body language and the mental state of the prophet when he would give these revelations, right? So there was a sense in which people could really clearly tell when he was speaking, I guess more normally or generally, you could say, versus when there's something that is something which we would consider a Qur'an, right? Or a recitation, right? Because Qur'an means recitation. So each of the ayahs are also Qur'ans, you could say, right? So whenever he's giving a Qur'an or a recitation, people knew he was doing that. It was very obvious from him, right? And so there was a sense in which the way it seemed is that as if there was God himself in some sense passing this message through the prophet, right? There was a very different, there was a very obvious change that took place where you could see that the prophet in some sense is being overtaken by something higher and greater when he speaks, right? And so my words will be put into his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command of him, right? And whoever will not hearken unto my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him, right? So this will be a binding covenant, right? So he's reinforcing once again that these words are my words, and I will require people to heed this. Okay, so this is yet another popularly understood line in the Bible, which is considered by many Muslims to be referring to the Prophet. All right, and I'll turn your attention to one more line. There are actually other ones. We could also look at the Gospels, but I'm going to put references for some of these other lines down below under the video because we don't have time to go over every single one. It'll take too long. So we'll look at one more line in Deuteronomy. So this is Deuteronomy 33:1. And this one says, the Lord came from Sinai and rose up from Seir unto them. He shined forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000 saints. And from his right hand went a fiery law for them. Okay? So there are three locations that are mentioned here, right? So this idea that the Lord came from Sinai, the Lord also rose up or rises up from Seir and shines forth from Mount Paran. Now, what is this? So first of all, we're talking about the Sinai. Where is the Sinai? So the Sinai is in Egypt, right? Sinai this is one of the least controversial parts of the whole thing. The Sinai very much, as you know, there's consensus that this refers to the Sinai Peninsula, or referring to Egypt, right? And of course, then what that tells us, the most eligible person, and considering who it is who's actually speaking this line, right? Deuteronomy is something which is revealed or spoken by the prophet Moses, right? And Moses, as we know, according to the parables, the stories that are told in scripture, came and liberated the Jewish people from Pharaoh in Egypt, right? That is where the community was. That is where the exodus or the exit, was conducted by Moses, and in order to take the people to the Holy Land, which people say is in the land of Israel, Palestine, that area, basically, right? So that's Moses. Now, what about the other parts, right? Because we're talking about also a place called Seir. So Mount Seir is actually a place that actually exists within the historical kingdom of Israel. And this is basically considered to be a reference to Jesus, the idea that Jesus is going to arrive and be another form or of the Lord, right? The Lord descending or rising up in this case, right? So that is popularly understood to be a place that for Christians and also Muslims is referring to the idea of the coming of Christ. So Christ is also being, in a sense, predicted here. in this line of the Hebrew Bible. And then we have Mount Paran. Now, of course, this is the part that is more, there's controversy about what this is referring to. But the Muslims, by and large, and also a number of non-Muslim scholars, think that there's an argument to be made that Mount Paran is referring to a certain place in the Hijaz, in Arabia. So for this reason, we would say that this is probably talking about the Prophet, okay? So it matches in terms of the region, as Paran referring to this area in the Hijaz. And also it mentions the idea of coming with 10,000 saints. Now, what does that mean? So this is popularly understood to be referring to the 10,000 believers of the Prophet who came and conquered Mecca at the end of basically the early Islamic wars, right, against the indigenous, the people who followed the indigenous religions of the time in Arabia. The Prophet was and his followers were embroiled in conflict with these indigenous faith groups in Arabia, right? And so the 10,000 saints refers to his final victory when he conquers Makkah, the holy city where the Kaaba is located, right? And then, of course, it mentions that from his right hand went a fiery law. And of course, this fiery law, what are we talking about? We're talking about, again, the establishing of a new covenant, right? The Sharia, right? So we're talking about the idea that just as Moses reveals a law for the Jewish people, a Sharia for the Jewish people, right? And that was mentioned in Deuteronomy 18. Again, we're getting a reference to the fiery law, right? So we're talking about a law that will come forth from his right hand. And so we're talking about, this is again another thing that reinforces the idea that we are talking about the Prophet Muhammad being discussed in the Bible. And so from here, this is how much I'm going to cover in terms of the Bible. So we're now going to go to another important story within Islamic tradition. But like I said, there are more references, and those will be posted below under the video. So feel free to check those out and read those references for yourself. And if you have any questions about any of them, you can comment on the video, and we can, I can address that. So, and the final thing that I want to cover when it comes to Nass or designation is a very popular narrative that is given in the Prophet's Sirah literature, right? So Sirah referring to different versions or accounts of the Prophet's life story. So the Sirah literature tends to talk about how the Prophet grew up, right? Who his family was, where did he come from, what was he doing, sort of, all these different aspects of his history before his prophethood, and then of course the story of his prophetic mission until his death. So that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about Sirat literature. So one popular account that you will find in this literature is a story involving someone that is known as Bahira or monk Bahira, or there are different ways in which he is referred. And an encounter that this person has with the Prophet when the Prophet is actually very young, he's still a child. So quite a bit before his prophetic mission, right? So the Prophet Muhammad becomes a prophet, or officially begins his prophetic mission at the age of 40. So this is quite a bit before that, right? So the context of this story is that one of the major economic activities that took place in the Arabian Peninsula were these different caravan trading jobs, right? Like these different businesses or ventures that were done with these caravan trains, right? In order to conduct trade with nearby places, right? This was a very important source of revenue for the region. And so many members of the Prophet's own family, and eventually the Prophet himself, was very much involved in this trade. So what the story tells us is that one day when the Prophet is fairly young, he accompanies his one of his uncles, Abu Talib, and a number of other people to Syria. Okay, and this was something that they did very commonly. Syria was a very common destination for these trading missions. And so this was actually a very routine journey that was made by people in the Hijaz. So this is another one of those trips, and in this situation, Abu Talib, who himself has also been, on this, has been on this journey many times, decides to take the Prophet Muhammad with him, right? And so little Prophet Muhammad goes with Abu Talib and a number of other people who are part of the trading caravan. They go to Syria, and as they approach Syria and to the place where they're going to be basically stopping to rest and eventually then conduct their business, there is a certain somebody in Syria who gets an interesting premonition, or he sees a sign. Some people say something to do with clouds. He sees something in the sky that tells him that something that is long awaited is approaching, and that he needs to attend to this, right? So this person, of course, we're talking about Bahira. And Bahira is this person who, according to the narrative, has been living in this small house kind of place, which has been held by a number of Christian monks for a number of generations. So he's the latest in a line of Christian, monks or religious men who have occupied this particular house or area, this plot of land. Okay, and so he's been living there, and he is someone who is also said to be the guardian of a number of important teachings, prophetic material, different sorts of things. The idea is that he's not just any old Christian monk or holy man, but is somebody who is part of a certain group which has privileged information, right? Or that's how it's stated. And so this Bahira figure basically gets this sign, or, based on things that he observes in the sky or something like that, that the long-awaited prophet, a new prophet, is coming, and that this is the moment in which he's going to be the one to encounter this prophet that has been long awaited. So what happens is that there is a party. Of course, the party that we're talking about is Abu Talib's party, interestingly enough, right? So this group of people is now approaching, and Bahira notices that the signs he sees in the sky are seeming to follow along with this caravan that is coming in. And so this indicates to him that the person he's waiting for is a part of that caravan, right? So this is the group of people that he needs to be looking into. And so as the caravan is coming, Bahira says, oh, hey, why don't you stop here and rest? I'll give you guys some hospitality. I'll feed you, water, all that. Just, come here and let me host you for a little bit. Just, you've been on a long journey. Come and rest here. That's very common for travelers to come, and we extend that hospitality to people all the time. And so the party of Abu Talib and Muhammad end up stopping at Monk Bahira's place, right? And then Monk Bahira then says, I want you to make sure you bring every single person in. So don't leave anybody outside. I want your entire party to come into my, nobody, even if they're a servant or something, like, I'm not concerned about their status or whatever. Nobody needs to stay outside. I want to host all of you. So bring everyone in. And so just about everyone comes in, except for Muhammad. Because even despite what Bahira, basically told or instructed the party to do, basically they wanted to leave somebody outside to watch the animals and so on and so forth. Right? Usually, it's very common that if you're going to leave your caravan, your goods and stuff, you don't want to leave them unattended, right? You want somebody to be looking after them. And so they thought, okay, well, Muhammad is just a kid, he's a child. Everybody else here is an adult. He's the only one who's a minor. Um, it's not going to matter if he's outside, and we do want somebody to watch, our stuff and our animals and whatnot. And so we're going to leave Muhammad outside. And so that's what they did, right? And they felt like, okay, it's not a big deal. It should be fine, right? But the thing is that Bahira sees all these people coming in, and they're all sitting down. They're there, but something's not right from the way he feels. He feels that this is not right. He doesn't see the signs of the person that he is looking for, right? He doesn't see that certain something, that kind of aura that he might be looking for on any of these people. And he's like, and for him, it doesn't make any sense, right? Because he's very sure that he's read the sign correctly, that whoever this person is that he's waiting for should be in this group, right? This is in this group, one person from among these people is that person. And so he asks the party members, he says, are you sure everybody is present here? Because I told you to bring everybody inside, every single one. Are you sure this is all of you? I feel like there's somebody at least who's missing. And they say, well, yes, actually, little Muhammad is outside. Because we want someone to watch our animals and our stuff. And, he's a kid. We figured, we know that you said to bring everybody in, but he's just a child, right? So it's like, we figured by everybody you meant, the men, right? All the men, the grown men, you wanted everybody to be inside, and it wouldn't matter if Muhammad was here or not, right? And Bahira says, no, everybody needs to be here. So I, bring Muhammad in immediately. And so his wishes are complied with, and Muhammad is brought in. And when Muhammad comes in, Bahira immediately recognizes that this is the person. Or he gets that feeling that I think this is actually the one I was looking for, because there's something that he sees in him. But he wants to be completely certain. And so there's a couple different things that end up taking place. He asks the Prophet about his history. So he tells the Prophet to talk about, who his family is in a sense. And he asks him about his habits, different things about his life. So there's a sense in which Bahira is looking for certain signs within his life story that he's probably aware of, that were predicted to be qualities of the Prophet in some sense, who is to come. Another thing he does is he examines his back. He tells the Prophet to take his shirt off. And it said that he found a certain birthmark, or there was a certain mark on his back somewhere that was predicted to also be present on the future Prophet. And another thing that was asked is, he says that, okay, before he had started this conversation, he says, okay, well, who is this guy? Like, is he one of your kids, or who is this? And Abu Talib says, yeah, he's my son. So because in a sense, right? Because Abu Talib is very close to there. He's one of his uncles, and a very close uncle at that. And we know from the later stories of the Prophet that, he's an extremely important figure in all of this, and that they were absolutely very close. And so he's like, okay, he's my son, right? He says, like, yeah, he's my boy. But Bahira is like, no. Maybe he's your boy in a sense, but he can't be your son. He's like, are you sure about that this is your son? And he says, well, no, technically he's not my son. Actually his uncle. One of my brothers is his actual dad, but he passed away. And Bahira was like, yes, that makes sense, because from what I am expecting, yes, his father should not be alive. So he was like, that's how I know. So there's no way, the person who I'm awaiting, his father cannot be you, because his father is said to be somebody who will have passed away when I meet him. And so this is all very perplexing, right? Because they're like, he's talking about Muhammad as if he knows him. even though they've never met before. But he's aware of all these different things. And basically, upon fully confirming all of this and coming to a conclusion that, Bahir, as feels certain within himself that this is the person that he's waiting for, he then tells Abu Talib that Muhammad is a chosen messenger of God, and that there is an important mission that he is here to fulfill, and he tells him that you need to protect him, keep him safe, because he's going to need that, because he's going to be in danger. His mission is going to involve danger. There will be people who will be his enemies, and so he told Abu Talib that you must protect him. You must take responsibility to keep him safe from the people who will be his eventual enemies. And so that is yet another situation where we have a designation, right? And this designation, comes from somebody who is part of the Christian community. And this makes sense why, if we're talking about somebody giving designation, the major faith tradition that shows up before the Islamic revelation is the Christian tradition, the Christian revelation, right? And so the idea is that just as how you have, Jesus himself, and also Moses, so within that Judeo-Christian tradition, we see this prediction of the prophet. We would then expect that, anybody who is truly then has been faithful to that message and actually held the true or real understanding of the Bible and the Torah, someone from among them would be aware and would realize, okay, who the prophet is, and they would be the person to make that indication, so that the people in Arabia will be aware, right? So there's a sense in which there is a formal designation that is given, that is done, so that the people are aware and that it's not ambiguous, right? And so it makes logical sense that this will be someone from within the Christian tradition, right? Because they're the ones who sort of hold that message, that knowledge, which should then lead them to the coming prophet, right? And so that basically is going to be our summary here of talking about Nass. Because again, there are other stories. There's also a story of someone who's known as Waraka, but I'm not going to go over that in this lecture because again, it's going to go on for too long, and I want to keep this as brief as possible. But you can read about the story of Waraka and certain other, stories that have to do with the prophet's early life and things that sort of marked him as being chosen. We can find those in a book that I've referenced below. It's a story of Muhammad that's written by someone named Martin Lings. It's a very, very good Sirat text. So I'm going to put the reference for that down below. And so you can refer to that. That book's pretty easy to find a PDF for online. So you can check that out and see other things that were written as well about the prophet and sort of what marked him as being designated by God. Okay, so that concludes our episode on Nass. There will be more discussions about Nass as we start talking about imams and things like that in the Shia tradition. But as far as in terms of the prophet or how Nass has to do with, how the prophet himself had this quality or was given a designation, that's basically what we're going to be talking about for right now. And so the next episode is going to be talking about lineage, right? Because we talked about how Nass, designation, lineage, and the Mu'jiza or the prophetic miracles were the three major signs, right? The three major things that the prophet holds as proof of his office, right? So we'll be looking at the lineage part next. After that, we'll look into the prophetic miracle. So until then, farewell to everybody. Thank you so much for watching. The next episode will be continuing the Reason and Faith series that I had started, before then going back to the history. So we'll just be alternating. Every episode will we'll go back and forth between those two. So until then, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, comments, please make those comments and ask those questions below. Share and like if you enjoyed the content, and hope to see you next time.